Okay, so we're going to get going. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, which focuses on an overview of a new resource from the MRCT Center, a toolkit for supporting the design, conduct, and reporting of long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies being released today as a draft for public comment. The format for today's webinar is that I will provide an introduction to an overview of the toolkit, and then we will turn to a discussion with three panelists, all members of the MRCT Center's long-term follow-up working group who have been involved with the toolkit's development. My name is Carolyn Chapman, and I'm a lead investigator at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a member of the faculty at Harvard Medical School, and I lead the Cell and Gene Therapies project at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. Before we get started, I want to note that closed captioning is enabled. If you would like to view captions, please click the CC Show Captions box, and please make sure to keep the captions in English. If you change the language, it will change the language for everyone. Next slide, please. The MRCT Center is a research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world. We engage diverse stakeholders to identify emerging issues in global clinical trials and collaboratively create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. Next slide, please. Please note that the work shared and opinions expressed today are those of the authors and presenters and do not represent the positions of Brigham and Women's Hospital or Harvard or any of our organizational affiliations. The MRCT Center is supported by grants and gifts, and more information can be found on our website. Next slide, please. To provide just a bit of background, the Cell and Gene Therapies project is aligned with the MRCT Center's overall mission. It aims to identify and characterize challenges arising in the global research and development of cell and gene therapies, and then leveraging the MRCT Center's broad network, convene different stakeholders and collaborate to co-develop ways to address the identified challenges. Next slide, please. So long-term follow-up studies, which you can see at the intersection of that Venn diagram on the right, were chosen as an initial focus area for the Cell and Gene Therapies project for a number of different reasons. Next slide, please. Gene therapies are a complex class of therapeutics that involve transcription or translation of transferred genetic material or alteration of human genetic sequences. Many gene therapies have the potential for long-lasting and transformative health benefits, but there are also long-term health risks. Therefore, the FDA and other regulatory authorities recommend long-term follow-up studies of recipients of certain types of gene therapies, including those involving intentional and/or possible unintentional alteration of the human genome. Next slide, please. So long-term follow-up studies are important for many different stakeholders, including patients, sponsors, regulators, the medical community, and society at large, because the information gained through long-term follow-up is important for decision-making in research and clinical care, which has implications for regulatory evaluation of the benefits and risks of gene therapies, investment into these products, as well as reimbursement policies for them. Next slide, please. However, long-term follow-up studies, because they last years, perhaps even decades, there are significant scientific, operational, and logistical challenges associated with them, and they're burdensome for patients, academic investigators, and companies of all sizes. Next slide, please. To better understand, characterize, and try to address the challenges associated with long-term follow-up studies, the MRCT Center launched a working group in September 2024. Today, we are releasing a long-term follow-up toolkit as a draft for public comment. You can download the toolkit from our website, and we will put that link in the chat, and it's also on the slide here. And we welcome your suggestions and feedback, and the center's email is right on this slide as well. Next slide, please. So the toolkit is organized into 11 different sections, and with the help from Lindsay Henriquez, an informational design specialist on our team, The PDF enables easy navigation to various sections and subsections via multiple clickable interactive toolbars. The heart of the toolkit is made up of three sections, which are highlighted in teal: the guiding principles, considerations and recommendations, and the looking forward sections. The other sections provide additional resources as background or helpful information. There's a lot of substance and detail in the toolkit, so we won't be able to review it completely today, but my job is basically to provide an overview so you are inspired to check it out for yourself. And then we'll have a discussion with our panelists. Next slide, please. One of the sections, for example, provides descriptions of different types of long-term follow-up studies. Next slide. This includes long-term follow-up studies that follow recipients of investigational or approved gene therapies, studies that use an integrated or standalone protocol approach for post-clinical trial long-term follow-up, studies that are classified as observational or interventional, which have different regulatory implications and reporting requirements, and those that are considered registry or registry-based studies, as well as those that use centralized or decentralized approaches. Throughout the toolkit, on the right side of the page, you can navigate to the different sections of the toolkit. And so you can see that types of LTFU is highlighted in that blue on the right-hand side of the page. But in some sections, there are also additional toolbars that allow you to jump to different subsections. For example, in this types of long-term follow-up studies, you can click on the left symbols there to jump to the different subsections. Next slide, please. So this just shows you jumping around to the different subsections of this types of long-term follow-up studies section. Next slide, please. So the section on flowcharts, next slide, please, shows different paths of long-term follow-up in the context of research. This is the slide, the flowchart in the context of research, which is the main focus of this toolkit. And so you can see that we have long-term follow-up for recipients of investigational gene therapy products, and that long-term follow-up can proceed post-clinical trial through an integrated or standalone long-term follow-up study. And for recipients of approved gene therapies, some folks will participate in long-term follow-up studies as well, which would be standalone and possibly designed as a registry study. Next slide, please. But we also include a flow chart on follow-up that occurs for gene therapy recipients in the context of clinical care, either whether you received an investigational product or an approved product. And although this isn't the main focus, there's various intersections that are discussed throughout the toolkit. Next slide, please. So the guiding principles section, next slide, please. These guiding principles provide a high-level framework for the ethical design, conduct, and reporting of long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies, and they span a variety of topics. So you can see that on number 7, I'm just going to point out a few of them. Number 7 is there are trade-offs between expanding the scope of long-term follow-up studies and minimizing burdens on participants, sponsors, and others. And the need for long-term follow-up data collection and monitoring should be balanced with the need for participant adherence and retention. The burdens of long-term follow-up studies on participants and study sponsors should be justified by the knowledge to be gained about the benefits and risks of gene therapies and minimized to the extent possible. And then number 9 is to maximize the scientific value, interpretability, and interoperability of long-term follow-up studies. Adverse event monitoring and reporting should be standardized and harmonized to the extent possible to facilitate meta-analysis across products and patient populations. And then another one is number 18, which states sponsors and researchers should make every effort to publicly and transparently share final and interim as appropriate aggregate results. Next slide. So the most detailed and longest section of the toolkit is the considerations and recommendations section, which is actually made up of 9 subsections. Next slide, please. So these nine subsections include purpose and limitations, objectives and endpoints, anticipating protocol, technology, and site evolution, enrollment and informed consent, participant retention and withdrawal criteria, signal detection and safety reporting, data sharing and dissemination of results, operationalizing the long-term follow-up protocol, and clarification of responsibilities. And as you can see on the right side, each of these subsections is organized by a short introduction, and then we have the considerations and recommendations. So for each consideration, there's at least one recommendation. So in this case, for the objectives and endpoints, we note that consideration one is the involvement of patients and care partners is critical for the ethical design and conduct of long-term follow-up studies. And recommendation 1.1, patients and our patient advocacy organization should be involved in the design of long-term follow-up studies to ensure inclusion of primary and secondary endpoints that are most meaningful and relevant to patients, their families, and care partners. And as you can see in this long section, there's also a toolbar that enables jumping around to the different sections. They're basically can be read independently and are considered generally standalone. So you don't have to read through the whole thing, and you can read through what is most of interest to you. Next slide, please. And so basically this shows you some of, a page capture of the enrollment and informed consent page, a page capture for the participant retention and withdrawal criteria subsection. Next slide, please. And then this shows anticipating protocol, technology, and site evolution, which I think, we'll discuss a little bit later, and data sharing and dissemination of results. Next slide, please. Another key section of the toolkit is the looking forward section, in which we offer questions about the scope of long-term follow-up. Next slide, please. Data harmonization and data sharing that the working group thought needed future consideration and deliberation. So basically, although the toolkit is really comprehensive, there's still work that needs to be done. We did not yet solve all the issues and challenges related to long-term follow-up, and our aim is to push the conversation forward and also provide helpful resources to do that. Next slide, please. So for example, echoing some of the things I said earlier about in the guiding principles, key questions from the looking forward section include questions about data harmonization, what incentives, if any, will drive efforts to harmonize long-term follow-up data definitions and collection, optimize interoperability, and share data and results to maximize value, considering whether a central repository for long-term follow-up data, enabling studies that include larger numbers of gene therapy recipients would be useful, and who should develop and manage such a repository. And lastly, questions about transparency, about what incentives, if any, will propel increased long-term follow-up data transparency, information sharing, and reporting of results. Next slide, please. So the last resource that I'll highlight today is the key design elements of long-term follow-up studies for FDA-approved GTs. And although this information is publicly available, it is not centralized and can be difficult to find. So in the next slide, please. So in this table, this just shows the first page of a rather long table, but you can find out about how long-term follow-up was designed for these products, including whether they followed recipients of investigational or approved gene therapies or both, whether they were designed as standalone or integrated protocols, whether they were based on a registry, and whether they were classified as observational or interventional. And some other basic characteristics about the studies and how to find out more are also included. And next slide, please. So just to say again, the toolkit is the result of a huge collaborative effort. Members of the working group who have chosen to be acknowledged are listed here as well as in the toolkit. And I'd like to especially acknowledge my MRCT Center colleagues, Amina Burbeck, Mina Sheikh, Lindsay Henriquez, and Barbara Beer for their contributions to this project and work. But again, this couldn't have happened without everybody on this page and others who are not even listed. And that again shows you the link for the toolkit as well that you can download. Next slide, please. And so now it's really my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today, three members of the long-term follow-up working group who have contributed to the toolkit's development. We have Barbara Arone from IQVIA, Patty Cullinan from Adverum Biotechnologies, and Durhan Wong Rieger from the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. And I think we can take the slides down, and I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get to hear their perspectives as well. And I think, Durhan, we're going to start with you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to express both my appreciation for being invited to be part of the working group for the long-term follow-up group, recognizing the value of having patient voices directly in there, but also for the opportunity to participate and really learn about the variety of work that's going into it. I am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders here in Toronto, Ontario. I also serve as president of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations, and am involved with a good number of other international groups, mostly around rare disease. So this is obviously a very pertinent area to us. I mean, within our patient community, we have a number that already have gene therapies, and have, varying degrees of requirements and engagement for long-term follow-up, including, Luxturna for inherited retinal diseases, the big one that we have worked with very much over the years, spinal muscular atrophy and Zolgensma for access there. We now have a therapy for thalassemia, and same for sickle cell disease and for hemophilia. I mean, the difference, I think, in some respects is adult patients versus children. I mean, with SMA, parents and the need for parents to remain involved. We also have a huge number of patient organizations or patient groups that are looking forward to the ability to access gene therapies. I've just spent a weekend with the Huntington Society group, and you can imagine the excitement in that community to finally see the opportunity to have access to the first therapy, and maybe one of those first therapies, in addition to the mRNAs, et cetera, being a gene therapy. Mind you, a very daunting gene therapy that, is kind of very difficult to think about when you think about drilling the gene directly into the brain. But I had a little conversation with them as well about what are the benefits and challenges in terms of long-term follow-up. And we can talk a little bit more about the discussion, but just having this toolkit and having it so accessible to the patient community, from my point of view, is a huge asset, because it can help us orient to patients in terms of what is required, why they need to be involved, but also to help make sure that the information continues to be developed as we move along. So huge congratulations actually to Carolyn and the team for putting together such a guide. And thanks again for the opportunity for the ability to participate over these. I don't know how long it's been, but it seems like forever, but it was a good experience.
It hasn't been that long. As a working group, we've only been together since September 2024. So I think we've really moved quickly to try and put our thoughts down and get organized. And again, it's just a first step. But Durhan, thank you so much for being part of this, and really appreciate your time today too. Barbara, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Barbara Aroni, and I work at IQVIA, which is a service organization that supports the industry and the development of medicinal products, and then moving through studies. So I have been in the field of real world research. I sit in a real world part of our organization. I've been in the field of real world research for 20 plus years, and I am always focused on how real world data can help us to learn new things about patients. When we first started talking about the challenge of long-term follow-up for cell and gene therapy, maybe around 2020 or so, we started to look at what the regulations really meant, and think about how those needed to be operationalized. I immediately went to the question of, how can you make the data collection more efficient? And how can we think about how to operationalize this in a way that is going to be very patient-centric, but also sustainable? And so that's when we started thinking about the long-term follow-up and the combination of real-world data and real-world methods, and that intersection for long-term follow-up for the gene therapy, cell and gene therapy products. So this is a question that I have been looking at for the past few years, and I was thrilled to be invited into this working group. I feel like I've been shouting into the void on this question for quite a while, and it was so nice to be with a group of like-minded individuals who are looking at this problem from many different angles. I have found that part of what the strength of the working group really was that there were so many different perspectives, and we each do bring our own lens to the conversation. So I'm really proud of the body of work here in this guide. I think it reflects a lot of different perspectives. And I was very happy to be representing that real world methods, real world data perspective for long-term follow-up. So very happy to have been a part of this working group. And, you know, as an operations person, we certainly have not solved all the problems here. There's plenty more things to dig our teeth into as we think about how this will evolve and change over time.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, Barbara, for all your contributions, and again, also for joining today. Patty?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here as well. My name is Patrick Cullinan. Some people call me Patty. I currently am part of the regulatory affairs team at Adverum Biotech, an ocular AAV gene therapy company, where I lead medical writing and clinical trial transparency activities. Prior to joining Adverum, I had similar roles at Bluebird Bio for several years. Bluebird Bio, as many people know, was an LTV-based gene therapy company. And for many, many years before that, I was at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, where I had several roles, including data sharing of clinical trial data and transparency of clinical trial data, but also science advocacy, where I was the head of science advocacy. And in that role, I got to work with Harvard MRCT. And I worked on the diversity and inclusion and equity in clinical trials, data sharing in clinical trials, patient-friendly late summaries, return of results, so many, many initiatives. So clearly, I'm a MRCT fan. And when I was working at some of these gene therapy companies over the past few years, I started to notice some pain points as we were designing protocols and doing our FDA approvals and engaging with regulators. And I saw that there was a lot of uncertainty in certain aspects of how to conduct clinical trials in the long-term follow-up of the unmarketed investigational product, but also post-marketing and single patient INDs and non-conforming drug product. And there was just so many little areas where the team had to really stop and think and have a bunch of internal meetings that I sort of thought maybe MRCT, this would be a great initiative for MRCT to get involved in. And I reached out. There had just been a MRCT ethics and gene therapy studies, I think, that I had seen. And I thought, ooh, maybe MRCT could sink their teeth into this thing. And then when I spoke to Caroline and Barbara, they had said that they had had other outreach sort of from others on the same sort of vein, that this is an area where maybe they could have an initiative. So that was how I got into this and got embroiled in yet another adventure with Harvard MRCT. But it was a wonderful adventure. And the toolkit, I think, is a great tool for anyone starting out to try and think about designing gene therapy clinical trials. If I had had this, it would have been so much easier. So I think it's a great tool, and people should review it and provide more comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patty, for everything. As you just noted, you were, you know, an instigator of the whole project in your own way. And so we have to acknowledge that and thank you for that. And it was definitely, I think, a productive endeavor for all of us. And I think we'll, as Barbara said, we'll see where it goes from here. We're hopeful that we can keep pushing this conversation to optimize it and, you know, support best practices and really think about what is the best way to do this. So Durhan, I wanted to start with you and get more of your perspectives on how we can focus in terms of optimizing long-term follow-up studies. You know, really, how do we, you know, as we should be from an ethics perspective, put the patient at the center of these considerations?
Well, again, thank you very much. And I really do want to, kind of reflect on the toolkit, because I think this is a very important opportunity for us to get everybody on the same page. I think importantly, as I have mentioned, I think throughout the project, is that we really do have to engage the patient as a partner. You know, they're not just there as a recipient, they're not just there as a patient, and especially the family. They are genuine partners in the research. And I think as, you know, Pat and Barbara also talking about the real world evidence is not just a nice to have, right? It is something that's an essential part of the whole, you know, kind of access journey. And I think the sooner we can start patients with that perspective and families, right? Understanding that getting access to whether it's cell therapy or whether it's a gene therapy, that is just one component of it. And I think patients and families do get it. And obviously, we talk a lot about trying to make it more accessible to patients and reducing the burden in terms of travel or the kinds of testing they would have. But I think most important, it has to be attitudinal that we're here for the long term, and we are partners in this and not just recipients. We're not bystanders. I will say there's probably a difference in terms of communities as well when we speak with hemophilia. I mean, this is a very family disease, and people that have hemophilia are very much related to each other. They're related to the community. So I think again, emphasizing that we've had lots of hemophilia patients who have had access to gene therapy, and we've had 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year results now that have actually come back to the community to really inform them. That actually is very helpful. Having people that are involved, being able to participate, getting access to that learn-term follow-up, and then becoming ambassadors to really educate others. Again, being part of the process, I think it's important. But I think from the very beginning, as I said, I had the opportunity to speak with a Huntington Society group over the weekend. It was just on the announcement, we've got these amazing, studies done with 12 patients, et cetera, et cetera, and really talked about then, what their role is in terms of, patients and families that are going to be involved, throughout that process. And I would guarantee you that there's not a Huntington's patient, who's likely to get access to that treatment who would not feel very committed. Again, being a family disease, what can I do to contribute back to the community, to better understanding in terms of the results, but also being able to have access to those findings, right? So yes, the making it so that it's feasible, it's doable. We're really, as the I think the ongoing kind of protocol. So long-term follow-up in terms of being able to do it by distance, minimizing the the impact of having travel, et cetera, and really having a lot more that can be collected locally. I think it's going to be really important. We learn now how to dispense drugs locally. We learn how to support local healthcare professionals to support patients with these very specialized treatments. We can also make sure that that is part of the protocol, but really engaging patients to be really very much motivated in getting the information so that we can look at, how do we actually, learn from this and make it continually accessible to the patients.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sirhan. You bring up a lot of great points, which is that the patients do want to contribute. They're interested, as we said at the outset, that they're interested in the results as well, and for not only themselves, their family members, and their communities. And it's just a matter of trying to minimize burden and again, bringing in decentralized approaches, potentially, not having everything done at a centralized facility, especially if it doesn't need to be. I think Barbara's going to tell us a little bit more about that and the use of real world evidence. Um, and so why don't we go to Barbara next?
Sure thing. Yeah. So, it occurred to me as Darhan was talking, one of the things that I talk to people about and encourage them to think about is to think about when they're designing the long-term follow-up to be really conscious of the disease itself and not just the condition, but the situation around the condition. So you brought up the hemophilia community. Understanding and designing a long-term follow-up program that takes into account the condition and the support structure around the condition, how the patients, how the participants move through the healthcare system, what you expect their patient journey to be like after treatment, before treatment, understanding that full life cycle, that's really critical to designing a program that's going to be built around that. We talk about it as putting the patient, and we talk about it in the handbook, in the guidebook as well, putting the patient at the center of the journey. when we're doing clinical trials, the patient is a part of the center, but we're sort of revolving around the treating physician and the PI and the owner of the protocol, et cetera. But when we do long-term follow-up, the patient has to be the center of that story. Everybody else is orbiting around them. So in order to design a long-term follow-up that is cognizant of that, you have to have a really good understanding of that patient and that patient community, because the Huntington community is different from the hemophilia community, is different from the, pediatric hearing loss community. Like, these are different communities, and understanding how that community works together can be a really powerful foundation for designing your long-term follow-up. One of the things that the handbook attempts to elucidate, and that is important, is that this is not a one size fits all. There is not an easy answer for this. It has to be tailored to the condition, the community around that condition, as well as the countries where you're trying to operationalize this. Like, what are the laws and the rules and the social construct in those countries? Because working in Japan is different from working in Paris, is different from working in the US when you're talking about long-term follow-up. So an understanding of that environment, an understanding of the patient environment, and then, of course, an understanding of the treatment and what you're concerned about as a secondary to that treatment. So what are you worried about? So those three pieces are the building blocks that need to be understood to design the right type of long-term follow-up to sit over that. So I think that, again, I always jump immediately to the operations, immediately to the how are we going to do this? But those three pieces are the building blocks of how we're going to do this. Carolyn, the other thing I wanted to talk about was adaptation. Can I slide over into my adaptation topic?
Yes, of
Great.
course.
So one of the things that I think that to me is such an interesting challenge of these programs is the duration. This incredibly long timeline, this journey that these participants, these study or commercial participants are on. They're on a journey with us. And so 15 years is a very long time. And these programs are not set it and forget it. You do not do your long-term follow-up design and say, all set, I'll see you in 15 years when I've got some results. We know how quickly technology changes, regulation changes, social acceptance of technology changes. We learn new pieces of information. All of these things are going to change over the course of the 5 to 15 years follow-up that are mandated here. So I talk a lot with people when they're thinking about their operational plan on building in a cadence of change. So not waiting until you realize your program has gotten outdated or you're losing patients, that patients are wandering away and you're losing contact with them, but to put in planned times where every 3 to 5 years you stop and say, what is our operational plan? Is this still current? Is this still using the latest technology, the latest understanding, the latest regulations, and our understanding of these patients and this patient community? Are we still aware? Are we aware of everything we need to be aware of? And is this still the right operational design? If it is, fantastic, good for you, keep going. But it's possible that on that 3 to 5 year cadence, you might find out that patients would really prefer to be doing this on the telephone with you. They would prefer to get an email that asks them to fill in a survey. They have wandered, they feel very much cured and they're not interested in seeing the hemophilia center anymore. Okay, then where are they? How can we continue to get information from them if they've changed the behavior? So I think building in a cadence of adaptability, a cadence of adaptation into these programs is incredibly important. Part of the reason why that's important is because that sets the expectations for the audience for this data, right? So there are other people, like the people who care about the data that we're collecting. That's regulators, that's people within our own organizations, that's people within, that's patient communities. They're expecting the data to come out of this. And we want to set the expectation that operations may change over time in order to keep the program current and accessible and successful. And changes in operations should not be seen as a failure of the initial program. They should be seen as a part of the evolution. So I think setting expectations for people that these programs will evolve over time is really important to help people understand that changing the operational components, changing the operational strategy, tweaking that over time is not a failure. That is a planned adaptation of the program. So I think it's really important to set that expectation from the beginning. And that I think also helps the patient community, because you say, this is a burden right now. We get that. We're going to revisit it in a couple of years' time, see if we've learned new things, see how we can adjust this to make sure it's really working for you while still giving us the information that we need.
Yeah.
So planned adaptation.
Those are really great points. And just to say a couple things that you're bringing up things that I think, were discussed along the way. One of the things that we discussed was types of long-term follow-up studies, which I went through a little bit, but it was kind of like one of the things that, we considered was, should we have different guidance for different types of long-term follow-up studies, like investigational versus approved, for example. And ultimately, we decided that we needed to point out that there are different types of long-term follow-up studies, but that most of the principles and considerations apply to all types. But as Barbara pointed out, there's everything has to be done fit for purpose. That being said, we also mentioned in the toolkit that it would be nice if we could do more umbrella type or master protocol type approaches to make it to potentially minimize burden and enable sharing across studies. But the other thing that you mentioned too, about anticipating change over time, as I mentioned in the intro, we have a whole section about that came out from discussions about the need for anticipating these changes over time and what should you do about that. And thankfully, we had a lot of experts in the working group that were able to contribute and, to that section and putting forth, ideas about how to, as you say, design these studies with that type of a challenge, knowing that there will be changes over the length of the time that they last. So I think it really is important points and I mean, I think it's also, in the toolkit for further reference as well, for further
Absolutely.
ideas. Hmm.
Absolutely.
And Patty, do you want to share your perspectives?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a theme here, which is sort of finding balance in the trial. And I think the toolkit calls it the Goldilocks thing that we kept on talking about, like what's the just right amount of data? And one of the ways to identify that is to talk to patients. And all too often, we all say patients are involved in the design of trial, but it doesn't happen all the time. And if it does, sometimes it's a surrogate. But one of the key reasons I was interested in getting some multi-stakeholder feedback is when these trials are being conducted, there's a lot of competing pressures, right? Participants and sites don't want to have too many visits, too many invasive tests, too many tests where participants have to come to the central location for several days and get MRIs and biopsies and things like that. But the sponsor wants to get as much as they can out of the trial. The FDA wants as much data as they can to monitor the safety of the study. So there's all of these pressures. And having an adaptable trial over time is one way to do that, right? Monitoring retention, because the goal here is retention, right? Have the patients have a good experience in the study so that when they they don't consider dropping out over time, and you get as much robust data as you can. So I think that's a key thing is talking to participants, talking to sites, talking to regulators, and trying to find compromise in terms of too many additional endpoints or exploratory endpoints, too many invasive tests when the CDC might work as a first-line canary in the coal mine, and potentially not requiring travel to a central site for some of these things and having decentralized labs and scans and things like that. So having patients involved in that is really important. And then the other side, since we're talking a lot about patient involvement, is the communication pathways to the patient over 15 years. So it's not just a consent and you're done. If it is, then you're going to lose a lot of these participants, right? So there has to be clear communication, education at the start of even the parent study, not just the long-term follow-up study. How do you communicate actionable findings? How do you communicate findings that are of less clinical significance, that are maybe uncertain clinical significance? And how do you report interim results or return results to patients over such a long period of a study without affecting the data that comes out of the study. So I think a lot of this centers around engaging patients, sites, and regulators early on as you design your study.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, and I think I wonder if, we didn't have a chance, the Goldilocks issue, which is, just for anybody who's coming internationally, is a fairy tale, and there's like a just right message, which is, I think the porridge is too hot. The little girl comes into the thing, and the porridge is too hot or too cold and just right. And I think there's chairs and, size of chairs, and there's a whole series of things that are too big, too little, or just right. So, but that was one of the big themes actually that came up. And one of the recommendations is that the minimum data set should be that which is collected, largely with a nod to minimizing burden for patients and sponsors so that these things can get completed. At the same time, which data are needed. If you run a study for so long, you don't want to look back and say, oh, I wish we had collected X, Y, and Z. So it's definitely a challenge, and that's why we were here doing as a group trying to hash these out. I see in the chat or in the Q&A, someone is even asking a question about this. Saying, are there any differences in requirements for safety reporting? And the reason is that sites may have to collect a lot of information that may not be relevant, and also bringing up possibilities of recall bias. So in other words, again, it seems to be this question is relating to what to collect, how to collect it, and the best practices relating to that. If anybody wants to comment on that further.
I think the toolkit goes into the requirements for safety reporting, and I believe what it says is that they're the same, right? There's no difference as far as I recall. There is an issue of standardization of data and collecting it in different ways so that it's standardized. I don't think reporting is any different, but I'm not an expert in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a little uncertain about what the question is exactly asking, because I think that there's recommendations, for example, in FDA guidance about what types of outcomes to follow. But I think in terms of, there are obviously also reporting requirements related to severity of what happens to any of the patients, and there are specific reporting requirements that we actually do reference in the toolkit. But again, this issue, it seems to be the second part of the question seems to be hinting at the sort of the Goldilocks issue, which is how do we know if we're asking too much? I know that in the toolkit, it also says that if we ask too much of sites, for example, then there could be issues with actually getting it done, and and data validity over time. And so,
Yeah, and part of the question was if this was a decentralized site that's not in a big academic research center and might not be used to doing this sort of research, maybe it is uncertain to them, right? Especially if it's about contaminants, particles in the drug product, things like that. Maybe they wouldn't be used to doing that, and it's not a standardized form they're used to having or into their computer systems. So yeah, that could be something you'd have to work out as you design your protocol and educate the site staff.
yeah, thanks, Patty. Durhan or Barbara, would you like to add anything?
I was going to make a comment about the recall bias because that also speaks to that Goldilocks principle, right? Like you could ask somebody a question every month in order to make sure that you're pinning down exactly when an event happened and make sure that you don't miss any events. Is once a month often enough? Maybe you need to talk to them once a week. Maybe you need to talk to them once a day. No. You need to find the right time frame and the right mechanism for where that information is going to be. Can you avoid all recall bias? Probably not. But can you get enough information to satisfy your basic research question if you ask patients once a quarter, once every 6 months, once a year? Depends upon what you're trying to collect. So that's that Goldilocks principle. The long-term follow-up is a series of compromises where you've got to balance your need to know with what's realistic. That's why I think about it as sort of real world methods. There has to be some real work, like what is
Yeah.
the dream data collection, the perfect way to do this, you're going to need to come to some real world sort of compromises.
Right.
Yeah, you can't just take your clinical trial and then add the extra 10 years and say, okay, I'm done. It's a very different type of study design is needed.
Yep.
I think the challenge for patients is, I think a bit to what Patty's talking about, is what are we looking for? If we're looking for adverse events and we're understanding kind of what the adverse events might be and we can alert patients to that, that's easy. But in many cases, we're not sure what we're looking for. So engaging patients in over time, right, is what is it that we're reporting back? So, I mean, obviously, if some of the stuff is collected as biological samples, et cetera, it's one thing. It's another thing to say, what is it that we should be keeping track of? I mean, we have patients that are on long-term follow-up for all kinds of products, so obviously, but gene therapies or cell therapies, as we say, is those one-time interventions in which we don't necessarily have the patients automatically coming back because they've got to get either a refill or to get, approval for ongoing kind of care. But the other question that I've had asked to me is kind of like, who's responsible for this over time? So I'm committing myself to doing this. You say you're going to track this for me. Who is actually going to be collecting that information? And how can I make sure that I'm in that loop to be able to get that information back? It's sort of like having a car, right? The better our cars are, the less likely it is that we're going to need to have them going in regularly. On the other hand, though, we have no idea what to look for now in terms of, whether something is or in fact being recalled or whether there's an issue. So I'm just wondering, is there any thought in terms of, is there I mean, other than, the FDA regulator, which is always just looking at adverse effects, is there any other kind of a mechanism in which patients can have some assurance that, okay, if I'm reporting this, I'm actually going to be able to get it back?
Yeah, so Darhan, you're bringing up really important issues here and that are touched on in the toolkit. Like for example, we touch on bidirectional communication, and Patty also brought this up, which is that, you want to get information from the patients that are part of the study, but also we need to communicate with them to keep them engaged, but also in terms of the ethical obligations we have to share the results of these studies. And this gets into why we have the toolkit set it up as it is, because, first thing is obviously sponsors need to meet the requirements, regulatory requirements, and usually regulatory requirements are related to, reporting results, final results once a study's complete. Now, of course, long-term follow-up studies go for a longer period of time. And so they may not hit that regulatory requirement since it's not complete. The other thing that impacts reporting requirements is whether studies are classified as observational or interventional, that's one of the reasons why we went into this, like, which is why would they be classified as one or the other? And one of the things we say in the toolkit is that sponsors of long-term follow-up studies should aspire to be transparent in their reporting and potentially exceed regulatory requirements for reporting these studies because they're important. Obviously, we all agree they have value. They're important. They're important not just for that particular product, that the results of one product could be relevant to another gene therapy product, which has a similar, for example, backbone. So there's a lot going on here. The other thing is that how do we report individual results, which Patty started to get into as well, which is related to, the level of an issue, right? If it affects clinical care, obviously that would be actionable. But then we have gray areas of, what has personal utility. And so that can get very, a little bit murky that, a guidance document can't answer every question, you know,
And also, who do you report it to? Do you report it directly to the patient? It can be very complex, uncertain data. Do you report it to the academic center primary investigator? Most companies can't even contact the HCP for the patient, but should the HCP be looped into this or their local specialist? So that's an area that you have to map out even before you start the study, I think. And then the other space in terms of transparency is patient level data sharing for third-party research. It's complicated sometimes in these studies, A, because they take so long, but B, they might be in rare diseases or they might be observational, and that would exclude them from a lot of companies' policies. But also the data may be gathered through sort of disease-specific research networks and registries, and they own the data or are curators of that data or have the rights to that data. So if you don't plan data sharing early, it's not going to be possible. And it might even be fragmented. The sponsor may have a database for some exploratory or efficacy endpoints. This clinical research network would have the safety data. So if you don't plan it out early, a lot of companies will just throw their hands up and say, I can't do it. So I think pre-planning
Yes.
is important in the
And in
transparency.
the toolkit, we do say, there is a section that says that it should be planned. It should be thought out in advance. And again, Barbara's point that, things might change, but at least there's some kind of structure in mind for what the protocol is if you have X or what happens
But
next.
also in contracting. So if you're contracting with these networks, it's hard to undo those contracts just to like empower data sharing. And a lot of those will have some language in there that could prohibit data sharing. So even before the protocol, when you're contracting with these networks, I think it's important to think about the transparency elements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Barbara or Turhan, would you like to add anything related to that? Or I do have some other questions. And so Durhan, I wanted to ask you, what are some factors that appear to increase or decrease commitment to long-term follow-up among patients who have received cell or gene therapy that would be, eligible for long-term follow-up? Because we do have a whole section, as I mentioned earlier, on enrollment and retention, withdrawal, because of course, if we're going to find out about the long-term benefits and risks of these products, we need patients to be followed for that period of time. And if not, we could have bias in the results or not get the results be accurate as they should be.
I mean, again, we don't have a whole lot of gene therapies. We don't have a whole lot of cell therapy. So it's not like we've got a lot of experience, but certainly having a very engaged patient organization is one of the key components. And they are the ones that serve as the nexus point for doing the communications back into the patient community. I think also when you've got things like cell therapy, right, where there's an ongoing enrollment process, having that long-term follow-up and having patients committed to doing that and returning that information as decision making to the clinicians, even in terms of choosing, right, which patients are most likely to do well, what is it you're looking out for. I think when there's that selection process and there's been enough patients to actually return that information, we're just beginning to get, I think, patient organizations that are tuned into this. And this is one of the reasons why we really are trying to do the discussions with the patient groups as we're moving forward, because they're the best ones to actually serve. It's also an interface back to the company, as also an interface back to, the ongoing researchers. I think, as Patty and others have talked about, the challenge oftentimes is, of course, is that you may have individual patients who may in fact have issues, and I think that becomes a little bit more challenging in terms of how does that information get communicated out beyond the community, etc. So I mean, again, patient involvement, patient engagement, but I think patients have to learn. I mean, the cell therapies have taught us a lot. Patients have to understand from the very beginning that this, even though you're on a one-term therapy, it may not last forever. And that's, hemophilia, we've learned, those factor levels may start to go down. We're talking about, we don't know, we've got 10, 12 years in terms of the retinal disease, but we don't know forever. So you don't want to put fear into people. You don't want people to kind of say, oh my gosh, but you do have to put it in there. And I think that's important, even with things like SMA, right? Again, letting the patients and the parents know you've got the one time, but we don't know, over a long term, whether or not that gene is going to continue to, behave in the way it's supposed to be, whether it's a replacement or whether it's a mutation. So I think we need to put that out there and share it honestly, not in a way that's frightening, but to let people know this is all still very experimental, and we need to bring back, I mean, with the hemophilia community, the experience of patients who've experienced declining factors have actually been a real boost in terms of people, one, making a decision, but also making that commitment to coming back. So recognizing again, we're too quick to say this is a one and done kind of a thing, where we know in reality, of course, we don't have enough experience to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think those are all really important points. And then Barbara, I wanted to ask you in terms of just as Durhan was saying that the long-term data is so important, but can be hard and, to get the commitment and depending on the specific situation, there's like new FDA guidance, for example, on post-approval methods for capturing safety and efficacy, for gene therapies and cell therapies. And so I was wondering if you wanted to speak to, how that guidance lines up with the toolkit recommendations and how, again, we can leverage the use of real world data, which then leads to real world evidence to assess the, long-term risk benefit profile of these products.
Yeah. So for if anybody hasn't seen it, there were two FDA guidance documents. I think it was just two that came out at the end of September this year. And one of them was about long-term follow-up, and the other one was about adaptive and innovative designs for cell and gene therapy studies for the low and small populations. I was very happy to see the guidance document out from the FDA because for those of us who've been thinking about this problem for a long time, after the regulatory documents came out, there were lots of questions back to the FDA to say, yes, we understand the regulations, but how are we supposed to do this? So the draft guidance that came out in September is an attempt to point us in the right direction of how to do it. I was very, very happy to see that the draft guidance actually overlaps with a lot of the same themes in the handbook. And in fact, our document goes a little bit further because the FDA says, think about real world data, think about registries, think about patient centricity, and think about decentralized. So it has a lot of the same themes, but it doesn't quite get to how you might
Doesn't
incorporate
have the
those into your
detail that we
thinking. Yeah,
provide.
exactly. So I actually think the two documents are very nice counterparts for each other. So it's good to hear the direction that the FDA is going. I think the handbook talks about it at sort of the next level of practicality. So they're quite nice companions for each other, and that just happened lucky for us that we matched so well with what they were thinking. But I do think that they're good counterparts for each other. So if you haven't read that FDA document, you could read it, or you could ask Copilot or Chat GPT to summarize it for you if you don't feel like reading the whole thing. But it matches very nicely up against the handbook, and you can see if you're interested in one of the topics from the FDA guidance document, there will be a corresponding section of the handbook in all likelihood for you to be able to reference as well.
Barbara, you should not sound so surprised that they actually do come together. It isn't as if we were working on separate spheres, right?
Yeah.
But very much so, as you say.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the folks that contributed to the handbook did contribute to some of the listening meetings that the FDA has had in the last couple of years. I'm sure Durhan was involved as well. So you're right. I shouldn't be so surprised that they line up nicely.
Yes, well, it was nice. Definitely, the timing did line up, and I think, of course, we'd love to hear all the feedback on our toolkit, and that's a draft guidance as well that the FDA put out. So I think the conversations will continue. I see that we're at the top of the hour, and so this hour just flew by, and I apologize for not getting to all the questions that we had on deck and from the audience. I will say that there's an innovative approaches webinar that does have information about master protocols that you might be interested in on our website, the MRCT Center website. There's additional resources, and I would just point to that Innovative Approaches webinar as a great resource on master protocol approaches for long-term follow-up. So as we conclude today's webinar, I'd really like to extend our sincere thanks to our panelists for sharing their perspectives. And thank you to Amina Burbeck and Kristen Bartlett from the MRCT Center for supporting this webinar. And thank you to everyone in the audience for attending either today or for listening to a recording, and also for just being interested and contributing to this discussion. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you, everybody.